Everybody thinks they're a little bit special. You probably think you're smarter than average, funnier than most, maybe a better driver than everyone else on the road. And honestly, that's normal. But what happens when that feeling of being special stops being a feeling and starts being a demand? That's where narcissism begins. Grandiosity. This is the one everyone knows. An inflated sense of self-importance so baked in that it's not just confidence, it's a worldview. You're not just good at your job, you're the best. You don't just deserve respect, you deserve special treatment. And if the world doesn't deliver, the world is wrong. Grandiosity is formally listed in the DSM-5 as a core diagnostic criterion for narcissistic personality disorder. It's not some pop psychology buzzword, it's in the manual, and it shows up two ways: a fixed internal belief that you are exceptional, and a constant need to be seen as exceptional by others. One is what you think, the other is what you need everyone else to think. Narcissistic personality disorder itself affects somewhere between 0.5 and 6.2% of the US population, depending on the study. Even at the low end, that's roughly 1 in 200 people. At the high end, 1 in 16. But grandiosity is just the front door. What most people don't realize is that behind it, there's a whole system running, and it needs fuel, constant fuel, the need for constant praise. So grandiosity is the internal belief: I'm amazing. But what good is believing you're amazing if nobody else seems to notice? That's where this comes in. The DSM-5 lists need for admiration as one of the core diagnostic criteria for NPD. And we're not talking about enjoying a compliment now and then. We're talking about a chronic structural dependency on external validation just to function. Think of grandiosity as the engine and the need for praise as the fuel. Without it, the whole thing stalls. In fact, dimensional diagnostic models place these two, grandiosity and attention-seeking, as the twin pillars of narcissistic personality. They're the beating heart of the whole thing. Now, you've probably heard the phrase narcissistic supply on YouTube or Reddit. It sounds clinical. It's not. That's pop psych shorthand. Clinicians just call it what it is: a need for admiration. Less dramatic, more accurate, and this trait has a measurable digital footprint too. Large-scale data consistently links admiration-driven traits to more frequent status updates, more followers, and more visible attention-seeking behavior on social media. Not proof of narcissism, obviously, but the correlation is there and it's not subtle. But here's the thing about needing constant praise. It means other people hold the keys to how you feel about yourself. And that creates a very specific kind of relationship dynamic: extreme arrogance. So here's a question the internet loves to argue about: is arrogance just confidence with better marketing? And honestly, it's not a dumb question. The difference is real, but it's subtle. Confidence is thinking you're good at something. Arrogance, at least the clinical kind, is thinking you're good at something and needing everyone else to be worse. It's self-assurance with a side of contempt. And this isn't just a vibe check. The DSM-5 literally uses the phrase pompous, arrogant demeanor when describing NPD. The ICD-11, which is the other big diagnostic framework used internationally, lists arrogance right there among the core narcissistic trait facets too. Both major systems looked at this trait and said, yeah, this one matters, and the data backs it up. A meta-analysis across 40 datasets, nearly 15,000 people total, found that arrogance as a measurable component of narcissistic grandiosity holds up consistently. That's not a single study with 30 college students. That's a massive psychometric pile of evidence saying this trait is real, it's measurable, and it keeps showing up. But here's the thing: not every narcissist is arrogant. Survey summaries suggest arrogance shows up in roughly a third to the low 40% of people flagged with narcissistic traits. So it's common, but it's not universal. Narcissism isn't one size fits all. Some narcissists are loud and pompous, others operate completely differently, which brings us to something a little less obvious: the obsession with being on top. Sense of entitlement. So we've got the grandiosity, we've got the need for applause. Now layer this on top: the expectation that the world should just comply. A sense of entitlement to special treatment is a formal DSM-5 criterion for NPD. And this isn't spoiled kid at a birthday party entitlement. This is a deep structural expectation that other people will automatically defer to you, whether you've earned it or not. And it's everywhere in clinical samples. Aggregated data shows entitlement reported in roughly 77 to 83% of people identified with NPD. That makes it one of the most consistently present features across the board. If narcissism had a starter pack, entitlement would be in the box. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Behavioral economics research has found that narcissistic entitlement is associated with something called steeper delay discounting. Basically, it's a measurable tendency to choose a smaller reward now over a bigger reward later. So entitlement isn't just an attitude problem, it actually reshapes how decisions get made. The entitled brain wants what it wants, and it wants it now. Not tomorrow, not after you've considered the consequences, now. And the ICD-11, which is the World Health Organization's diagnostic system, classifies entitlement under something called dissociality. That links it it to a broader pattern of antagonism towards social norms and other people's rights, not just rudeness. A fundamental disregard for how the world is supposed to work. So, what happens when someone with this mindset starts forming relationships? Preoccupation with power. So, we've talked about how narcissistic traits show up in how people see themselves. Now, let's talk about how they show up in what people want. Because one of the DSM-5 criteria for NPD is a fixation on fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, or ideal love. And that word fantasies is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. See, wanting power isn't the problem. Wanting a promotion, wanting influence, wanting to be really good at something, that's just ambition. That's healthy. The clinical issue is when the fantasy becomes all-consuming and when the pursuit of dominance starts steamrolling the people closest to you. And we actually have data on this. A study of 623 adults found that people with antagonistic narcissistic traits had a significantly stronger desire for power, specifically in their romantic relationships, and measurably worse relationship outcomes because of it. Not power at work, not power in politics, power over the person they're supposed to love. That's where it gets ugly. What's also interesting is that when researchers map out how narcissistic traits connect to each other in network analyses, power-related fantasies don't just float off on their own. They're statistically linked to both grandiosity and attention-seeking. It's structurally woven into the core of the disorder, not some side quest. Now, there's a genuine debate online about this. People constantly argue about whether strong leaders are narcissists. And the clinical answer is basically, it's not the drive that's pathological, it's the fantasy version of it, the one where you're an untouchable god, paired with a willingness to exploit others to get there. Ambition builds companies. Pathological dominance burns relationships to the ground. So what happens when someone with these traits encounters another person who has something they don't? Frequent envy. So here's one that gets its own line in the DSM-5, and it's a weird one because it goes in both directions. People with NPD experience intense envy of others, and they believe other people are constantly envious of them. At the same time, you're jealous of what everyone else has, while simultaneously assuming everyone else is jealous of what you have. It's like being convinced you're losing the race and winning it at the exact same moment. And this isn't some rare quirk. Aggregated clinical data puts envy present in roughly 72 to 78% of people with narcissistic features. That's nearly as common as entitlement, almost 4 out of 5. Now, pop psychology loves to treat envy as the most obvious narcissism red flag. Oh, they're jealous of you, must be a narcissist. But the clinical picture is more specific than that. This isn't garden variety jealousy like wishing you had your friend's car. It's envy fused with a paranoid belief that your own success is being resented by everyone around you. That combination creates an adversarial lens on the entire world. Everyone is either a threat above you or a hater below you. There's no neutral ground. And structurally, envy isn't just some extra emotion bolted onto the side of narcissism. In trait network analyses, envy clusters tightly with grandiosity and entitlement. It's woven into the core antagonistic cluster. It's not a symptom that shows up sometimes. It's load-bearing architecture. That dual direction envy, I envy you and you envy me, basically guarantees that every relationship feels like a competition. Which brings us to something a little harder to pin down, the thing underneath all that grandiosity. Exploitative relationships. So far, we've been talking about what's happening inside the narcissist's head. The grandiosity, the entitlement, the need for admiration, internal stuff. Now, we're talking about what happens to the people around them. Interpersonally exploitative behavior is a DSM-5 criterion for NPD. It means using people to get what you want without giving anything back. And clinical data suggests roughly 55 to 66% of people identified with NPD show this pattern. Not all of them, but more than half. And this isn't just inferred from other traits. The Pathological Narcissism Inventory, one of the most rigorously validated clinical tools for measuring narcissism, includes exploitativeness as its own dedicated subscale. It's measured directly. Researchers don't guess at it. They ask about it, score it, and track it. Now here's where the research gets heavy. Empirical studies consistently link narcissistic traits to greater aggression and meaningfully worse relationship outcomes. Antagonistic narcissism in particular predicts a desire for power in close relationships and patterns of conflict that damage both partners. Not just the person on the receiving end, both people. This is the part where pop psychology usually jumps in and says all narcissists are abusers. And that's an overgeneralization. The clinical data shows real variability in how exploitative a behavior shows up. Some people with NPD are manipulative in obvious damaging ways. Others are more subtle or situational or limited in scope. It's not one size fits all, but the direction of the evidence is clear. Narcissistic traits reliably predict worse outcomes for the people in those relationships. You can add nuance without letting the trait off the hook. So that's what narcissism does to other people. But what does it do to the narcissist themselves? Lack of empathy. You've probably heard this one before. Narcissists have no empathy. It's the go-to line. And it's wrong. Well, it's half wrong, which is somehow worse. The DSM-5 describes it as an unwillingness to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. But here's where it gets interesting. Empathy isn't one thing, it's two. There's cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand what someone else is feeling, reading the room, knowing that your friend is upset, knowing why, knowing what they need to hear. Then there's affective empathy, which is actually feeling something in response. That gut level ache when you see someone cry, that wince when someone gets hurt. A meta-analysis looking at narcissism and empathy found a small to moderate negative association with affective empathy, a pooled correlation of negative 0.162. But cognitive empathy, almost no deficit at all, basically zero. A clinical study comparing NPD patients directly to healthy controls confirmed exactly this: significant impairment in emotional empathy, but cognitive empathy totally preserved. They can read the room, they just don't feel it. And this isn't just behavioral data. Neuroimaging studies show that people with NPD have reduced gray matter volume in prefrontal and insular brain regions, the exact areas tied to emotional empathy and emotion regulation. The gap has a physical signature in the brain. Now here's why this distinction matters so much. Someone who can't understand your emotions is clumsy. They hurt you by accident. But someone who understands your emotions perfectly and feels nothing in response, that person has every tool they need to manipulate effectively. They know exactly what you're feeling, they know exactly what to say, and none of it costs them anything emotionally. Intact cognitive empathy plus zero affective empathy isn't a limitation. In the wrong hands, it's a superpower. So what happens when you take all of these traits, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the empathy gap, and ask whether they're set in stone? Fragile self-esteem. Okay, here's the twist. Everything so far has been building toward all that grandiosity, the arrogance, the power fantasies, the need for constant admiration, the rage when someone doesn't clap hard enough. What if none of that is confidence? What if it's the opposite? Clinical frameworks increasingly describe two phases of narcissism. There's the grandiose side, which is everything we've been talking about. And then there's a vulnerable side, defined by an unstable sense of identity, low self-worth, and extreme sensitivity to even minor criticism. Not two separate conditions, two sides of the same coin, often showing up in the same person. And here's why this took so long to pin down. The most famous narcissism scale, the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, basically had self-esteem baked into its design. If you scored high, you almost by definition also scored high on self-esteem, which meant the fragile half of narcissism kept slipping through the cracks. Researchers eventually built a different tool, the Pathological Narcissism Inventory, specifically to measure both dimensions, grandiosity and vulnerability, because the old one was only catching half the picture. Once you see the vulnerability side, everything clicks differently. The need for praise, that's not someone who knows they're great. That's someone who needs you to tell them they're great because they can't sustain the belief on their own. The envy, not I deserve what you have, but your success makes me feel like nothing. The explosive rage when disrespected, not strength. Panic. NPD also carries significant comorbidity with mood and anxiety disorders, which fits this model perfectly. The grandiose surface isn't the foundation, it's a structure built on top of something that doesn't feel secure at all. Pop psychology almost never covers this half. It's much easier to paint narcissists as purely arrogant and high-functioning, but the clinical literature increasingly treats fragility not as some rare exception to narcissism, but as a core feature of it. So what do you actually do with all of this information? Gaslighting. Okay, here's the thing. Unlike every other trait on this list, gaslighting is not a formal DSM diagnostic criterion. It's not in there. The definition varies depending on who you ask, and the research uses different operational definitions depending on the study. So the evidence base is thinner and messier than everything we've covered so far. That said, when researchers do study it, the numbers are not small. A systematic review of psychological aggression in intimate partner violence found that gaslighting style behaviors accounted for roughly 54.3% of documented psychological aggression incidents, over half. And research into the dark tetrad, that's narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism, found that vulnerable narcissism specifically predicts greater acceptance and use of gaslighting tactics. A workplace study of narcissistic leaders showed some variation by context and sample, which is a useful reminder that none of this is automatic. But the consistent finding across IPV research and personality studies is the same. Antagonistic personality features and gaslighting travel together. So why is this number 10? Because gaslighting isn't just another trait, it's what happens when all the other traits get aimed at one person over time. The grandiosity says my version of events is the only one that matters. The lack of felt empathy means your distress doesn't register as a reason to stop. The entitlement says I deserve to control this narrative. The exploitativeness awareness treats your trust as a resource to extract from. Gaslighting is the operational output of all 9 traits working together. It's not the most intense thing on this list in any single moment. It's the most destructive because it systematically dismantles the target's ability to trust their own perception of reality, and that's what makes it different from everything else we've talked about. Grandiosity distorts how someone sees themselves. Gaslighting distorts how you see yourself. That's the line. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.